Shakespeare wrote King Lear around 1605, shortly after James I was crowned as the King of England in 1603. It is based on a chronicled story set in the 8th century BC, dramatising the story of an aged king with no male heirs, who decides to divide his kingdom amongst his 3 daughters. Shakespeare uses a number of sources for this play, and as we analyse the deviations that Shakespeare makes from these, and the revisions that were made later on, using modern theories of imitation and intertextuality, we can get a sense of what Shakespeare wanted to highlight in this tale, his penchant for creating deeply flawed and yet empathetic tragic characters, and the Jacobean audience's disillusionment of the Stuart reign. Whilst the legend of King Lear was first documented between the years 265 and 268 AD, the history of King Lear by an anonymous playwright seems to be the first version of Lear adapted for the stage. For clarity, I will be referring to this earlier play as the Lear play and Shakespeare's version as King Lear. The Lear play was first performed in April 1594. In a journal article From Lear to Lear, Professor Martin Mueller posits that allusions to this play can also be seen in Richard III, Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, and Hamlet. Under Robert Maiola's 7 types of intertextuality, this would make the Lear play a source remote for these plays. For King Lear, the many quotations that Shakespeare makes that come directly from the Lear play solidify this as his source proximate, as Maiola puts it, the book on the desk. Shakespeare also used many other sources, namely Spenser's Faerie Queene, Sidney's Arcadia, and Holinshed's Chronicles. By looking at Thomas Green's 4 types of imitation, we see that this follows a strategy of imitation called eclectic or exploitative imitation, as he treats all traditions as stockpiles to be drawn on ostensibly, at random. History becomes a vast container whose contents can be disarranged endlessly without suffering damage. This is similar to the term contamination, which Roman scholars use to refer to instances where writers combine sources. Specifically in the case of the Lear play, Shakespeare's departure from the plot falls under heuristic imitation, advertising their derivation from the subtext they carry with them. They proceed to distance themselves from the subtext and force us to recognise the poetic distance travelled, in order to give it a modern voice. By doing so, Shakespeare creates a more grounded and humanist approach to the previous chronicles, as we will explore later. For the most part, the anonymous Lear play follows the chronicle. Old King Lear devises a love test for his 3 daughters. The 2 oldest, Goneril and Regan, flatter the king, whilst the youngest, Cordelia, refuses to. Outraged, Lear banishes Cordelia and she goes on to marry the King of France. Goneril and Regan begin to strip Lear of his remaining authority, and in the wake of their betrayal, Lear absconds to France. And Cordelia, moved by her father's harsh treatment, invades Britain and puts Lear back on the throne. The chronicle goes on, however, to say that Lear ruled for another 3 years before passing away, and when Cordelia inherited the throne, her nephews conspired against her, and she commits suicide while imprisoned. The anonymous author chooses to omit this, giving the play a happy ending to what is a tragedy. Jean Brink supplies that the audience of 1594 lived in a period so uncertain that even the staged end of a dynasty might have been intolerable. It was probably much better business to supply the audience with the dramatic pancreas of Lear and Cordelia's victory. The dilemma of a king with no heirs would be particularly poignant with a late Elizabethan audience, as Queen Elizabeth was now in her 60s with no children. Whilst the Lear play superimposes a happy ending on a tale that had ended unhappily in every previous account, Shakespeare does no such thing, and seemingly doubles down on the tragic ending. France's invasion of Britain fails, which deviates from all previous iterations of the Lear story, and Lear and Cordelia are held prisoner. The Earl of Gloucester dies, Cordelia is hanged in prison, Goneril poisons Regan, then kills herself after Edgar kills Edmund, Lear kills the guard that killed Cordelia and says that they also hung his fool, though some people interpret this as him calling Cordelia a fool affectionately, but the fool did just disappear in Act 4 and 5. Then Lear dies with Cordelia in his arms, and then Kent goes off claiming he's going to kill himself too. Also, Regan's husband gets killed earlier after doing the eye gouging thing. So, very different from all previous sources mentioned. In both Monmouth's and Holinshed's accounts, Cordelia commits suicide whilst in prison, but it is Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene that introduces the version that she died by hanging, making this another likely source proximate for Shakespeare. The particularly bloody nature of the ending brings to mind another type of intertextuality, deviating from the texts and instead looking at traditions. This type is conventions and configurations, as Shakespeare adopts a form of tragedy akin to Roman philosopher and dramatist Seneca. Senecan conventions in Shakespeare are most attributed to Hamlet and Titus Andronicus. However, Curtis Perry observes that King Lear is structured by a surprisingly comprehensive and sustained engagement with Senecan tragedy. The play is about the collapse of society, and the antisocial nature of Senecan tragedy is its major intertextual resource for thinking about the tragic self in relation to the community. This grounding of a royal tragedy through the eyes of the community can further be supported by Shakespeare's most notable addition to the Lear play, which is the subplot surrounding the Earl of Gloucester, his legitimate son Edgar, and his illegitimate son Edmund. Shakespeare found the inspiration for this subplot through one of his other source proximates, Sir Philip Sidney's Arcadia, which was published in 1593. This story of failed parental and child relationships is complementary to that of the King Lear story, and some argue that this story also influenced Shakespeare to change Lear's fate from his victory at the end of the Lear play to a tragic death. Both Lear and Gloucester die between joy and grief, as the Paphlagonian king does at the end of Sidney's story. Stephen Greenblatt observes further that the Gloucester plot is unusually full of intense treatment, and has the effect of suggesting that what is at stake extends beyond the royal family alone, that the roots of the tragedy lie deep in the nature of things. By making the addition of the Gloucester subplot, Shakespeare adds emphasis on Lear as a father and not just a king, and also the universal tragedy of divided families rather than just divided kingdoms. This creates a significantly more morally complex situation than in previous iterations of Lear, which is a noted Senecan convention in tragedy. Lear often frames his own grief and existentialism to humanity at large, and there can be no greater threat and uncertainty to a community than the fall of its governors. Such upheaval was described as intolerable for the late Elizabethan stage, but King Lear was written after the uncertainty of the throne succession. Shakespeare's reasoning for this change can be further elaborated on by observing another type of intertextuality in the revisions made to the play. A number of Shakespeare's plays existed in quarto, one of which was King Lear. It may have been based on his working drafts, or it could have been compiled by actors who performed the plays. Because of this, the quarto version, whilst being the closest in time to Shakespeare, is considered to contain errors. In the case of King Lear, the first quarto was published in 1608, and the second quarto was published in 1619, which made further corrections but had no major deviations. Then, in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, the first folio was published, a collection titled Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. The first folio's version of King Lear was drastically different from the quarto. There are roughly 285 lines in the quarto that are not in the folio, and 115 lines in the folio that are not in the quarto. The proposed reasoning for this is that the quarto was made up of Shakespeare's manuscripts before the play was performed, and therefore the folio was an updated version, taking into account actors' improvisations, audience feedback, and also potential censorship. There are many notable differences between the two, but the main one I'm going to be focusing on is changes to the final scene. In the Lear play, Goneril and Regan are unmarried at the beginning, but in King Lear, Regan is married to the Duke of Cornwall, who is cruel and hot-tempered, and Goneril is married to the Duke of Albany, who is mild-mannered but somewhat passive. In the quarto version of the play, it is the Duke of Albany who seemingly takes charge in the final scene, but in the folio version, a lot of these lines are given to Edgar, strengthening his character and therefore weakening the Duke of Albany. What is important about this detail is that he holds the Scottish title that the new King James I had held previously. If Shakespeare substituted the Duke of Albany as a compliment to James, he stopped short of endorsing Elizabeth's successor. There is no suggestion that Albany, who is associated with Scotland and with James, may prefigure a unified Britain. Revision as a type of intertextuality is problematic, as the revisions cannot be proved to have been made by Shakespeare himself. Robert Miola writes on revisions, "In these transactions, the reviser appropriates the authority of the author, and assumes control of the text. If an author's revision of his own work asserts his power and domination, then the reviser of another's work enacts a rebellion and usurpation. Because of this, we cannot be sure if these alterations were of Shakespeare's hand, showing his growing discontentment with James's rule, or is a reflection of the editor's, and by extension, Jacobin audience's own disillusionment." In conclusion, King Lear remains to be considered one of Shakespeare's crowning achievements, and in turn has been adapted many times throughout the years. By the essence of the theory of intertextuality, Shakespeare was undoubtedly influenced by the political climate of the time, but he made an active effort to create plays that surpassed the constraints of creating media that could only be appreciated by those experiencing those climates. Ultimately, Shakespeare's manipulations of the source material is in aid of creating deeply empathetic and human characters that transcend his contemporaries, having an impact on generations to come.